The clock on the living room wall said 9 at night when Lucas finally found himself home alone. His parents and younger siblings had gone out for a birthday party, leaving him with the responsibility of running the house. Lucas was a young man of 18, tall and thin, with dark hair and piercing eyes. He cherished the nights when he had the house to himself, a rare moment of peace amid the hustle and bustle of everyday life. He decided to enjoy the night watching a horror movie, his favorite genre. He grabbed a bowl of popcorn and settled into the couch, letting the darkness of the night envelop him as the rain fell outside. The film began, and the tension in the plot began to unfold. Lucas was completely involved in the plot, his mind absorbed by suspense and fear. He didn't even notice when the rain outside intensified, creating a steady rhythm of tapping on the window. As the film progressed, the atmosphere at home became increasingly tense. Every creak in the house, every sound of rain against the window seemed magnified by the darkness and silence. Lucas felt chills down his spine, but he couldn't look away from the screen. The film reached its climax, and the moment of greatest tension arrived. That's when a loud bang echoed from somewhere in the house. Lucas jumped off the couch, the bowl of popcorn falling to the floor, scattering popcorn like little white ghosts. His heart beat wildly as he looked around the dark room, trying to discern the source of the noise. The rain outside continued to pound the window, making it difficult to hear anything beyond that. Cautiously, Lucas approached the stairs that led upstairs. He climbed slowly, each step creaking beneath his feet. He forced himself to believe that his imagination was playing with him, that the noise had been caused by something trivial. But when he reached the top of the stairs and looked down the dark hallway, his breath caught. He heard a distant, barely audible whisper, as if someone was talking to themselves in a low whisper. The dim light in the hallway flickered and flickered, leaving Lucas in darkness for a brief moment. When the light stabilized, he noticed that the door to his room was ajar. He was sure he had closed it before going downstairs to watch the movie. With a shaking hand, Lucas pushed the door wide open. His room was dark, and he could only see the outlines of his familiar furniture. He turned on the light and looked around, but didn't see anything out of place. Once again, he convinced himself that he was becoming paranoid. Maybe it was the wind that had pushed the door open. Lucas closed the door and returned to the living room, trying to calm down. He collected the scattered popcorn and resumed the film, but the feeling of restlessness still accompanied him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer alone at home, that something sinister lurked in the shadows of the night. Lucas tried to ignore the uneasy feeling as he continued watching the movie. However, the atmosphere in the house had changed, and the rain outside seemed heavier than ever. Each thunderclap was like a haunting echo of what he was watching on the screen. As the film progressed, Lucas heard the distant whisper again. It was as if someone was speaking in an unintelligible whisper, but the sound seemed to be getting closer. He turned down the volume on the TV and remained silent, trying to identify the source of the sound. That's when he clearly heard his name being whispered Lucas. His eyes widened in terror. He knew he wasn't alone at home. Someone was there with him. He grabbed the TV remote like a weapon, ready to defend himself against the unknown. The light in the living room flickered and went out. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. The darkness was so thick that he couldn't see a foot in front of him. He knew he couldn't stay there, vulnerable and defenseless. Groping around in the dark, he reached for his cell phone in his pocket and used the light from the screen to light his way. The dim light revealed familiar contours of the living room, but there was still something wrong. Someone's shadow was cast on the wall, a shadow that wasn't his. He turned slowly, illuminating the room with the light from his cell phone. There was no one there, but the shadow continued to move on the wall, as if it had a life of its own. Lucas backed away, his heart racing. The shadow on the wall began to contort and take shape, and Lucas could clearly see a humanoid figure materializing. It was as if the darkness had come to life, taking the form of a hooded figure. He ran towards the front door, but when he reached it, he realized it was locked. Panic gripped him as he desperately tried to unlock it. The hooded shadow approached slowly, as if he was enjoying Lucas's fear. Finally, Lucas managed to unlock the door and stepped out into the pouring rain. He didn't look back as he ran down the dark street, his feet soaked with rainwater. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he needed to get away from that house. He hid under the awning of an abandoned store, trying to catch his breath. He looked back, but the hooded figure was no longer there. The rain fell relentlessly, and he felt completely lost and vulnerable. Lucas knew he couldn't go home that night. He needed help, someone to explain what was happening. He took his cell phone out of his pocket and dialed the number of a trusted friend, hoping someone could help him understand the nightmare he was living. But as the phone rang, he looked at the deserted street in front of him and had the feeling that he wasn't alone. Something was lurking in the shadows of the night, something that had followed him from the house. Lucas's journey toward the truth was just beginning, and he was about to discover that the terror he faced was deeper and more sinister than he had ever imagined. As Lucas waited for his friend to answer the phone, the rain continued to pour down relentlessly on him. The sound of rain mixed with the distant roar of thunder, creating a symphony of terror. The feeling of being watched never left him, and he kept his eyes fixed on the shadows that danced in the darkness of the empty street. Finally, his friend answered the call. Lucas frantically tried to explain the situation, but his speech was interrupted by the fear that dominated him. He couldn't find the right words to describe the hooded figure and shadows that chased him home. His worried friend insisted that Lucas go to his house so they could face the situation together. Lucas agreed, grateful that he wasn't alone on that terrible night. He left his hiding place under the awning and started running towards his friend's house. As he walked away from the street where darkness threatened him, he felt momentary relief. However, the feeling of being followed persisted. At every corner, he turned his head, expecting to see the hooded figure emerging from the shadows. When he finally arrived at his friend's house, he frantically rang the doorbell, desperate to get in and feel safe again. His friend opened the door with a look of concern and surprise. Lucas entered the house and explained everything that had happened, from the whisper to the shadow that materialized in the living room. His friend, although in disbelief, saw the genuine terror in Lucas's eyes and decided to help. They spent the night trying to understand what could be happening. Lucas searched the internet for supernatural phenomena and haunted house stories, while his friend checked the local news for anything that might be related to what had happened. As the hours passed, Lucas began to feel like time was dragging on, as if he were trapped in an endless nightmare. The rain outside was still falling, creating a gloomy backdrop to his growing worries. That's when they found news that made their hearts freeze. There were recent reports of a series of unexplained disappearances in the neighborhood. People who simply disappeared without a trace, without witnesses, without a logical explanation. Lucas knew it had to do with what was happening to him. He felt a chill when he realized that the hooded figure and shadows could be related to the disappearances. Something sinister was lurking that rainy night, and he was at the center of it. Determined to discover the truth, Lucas and his friend grabbed flashlights and ventured back to his house. They knew they needed to face whatever was there and find a way to get rid of the threat that was chasing them. When they arrived at the house, they found the back door wide open, as if someone had entered. Fear rose in their hearts as they prepared to enter the dark and unfamiliar house. Lucas was determined to discover the source of the darkness that had haunted him. He knew the answer was inside, in the shadows that moved around the house, in the dark memories that lurked in the corners. But facing this darkness would not be easy, and they were about to discover that the terror was far from over. Lucas and his friend entered the house, flashlights lighting the way through the oppressive darkness. The silence that surrounded them was deafening, broken only by the sound of their tense breathing and the occasional creak of the house's structure. They began to search the rooms, looking for any sign of the hooded figure or shadows that had haunted Lucas earlier. Every dark corner and every empty room. He remained on alert, with his nerves on edge. However, as they explored the house, nothing seemed out of place. There were no whispers, shadows, or mysterious figures. It seemed the threat had disappeared, leaving them with more questions than answers. Lucas was beginning to doubt his own sanity. Was everything he had experienced just a figment of his imagination? He felt ashamed in front of his friend, who had accompanied him on an apparently fruitless search. They returned to the living room, where the TV was still on, showing the horror movie Lucas had started watching before everything happened. The silent environment and the TV light created an eerie and unsettling atmosphere. That's when Lucas noticed something strange on the TV screen. In the film, the scene being shown was identical to the living room they were in. including the presence of the TV on. It was as if the film had been recorded in that house that same night. His friend was equally perplexed. They began to wonder if they were trapped in some kind of time loop, reliving the same night of terror over and over again. Lucas felt a chill go up his spine when he realized there was a hooded figure in the film, standing in the same living room. The film seemed to have a life of its own, showing the hooded figure approaching them on screen, as if it were about to step out of the TV and into real life. Lucas and his friend were paralyzed with fear, unable to look away from the TV. It was then that the hooded figure truly left the screen, emerging as an ominous shadow in the living room. Terror gripped Lucas and his friend as the figure slowly approached them, each step echoing in the darkness. They retreated, trying to find a way out, but they were trapped. The hooded figure approached, his presence emanating an aura of malice. They could feel the icy touch of darkness, as if they were in the grip of a nightmare. Lucas finally found his voice and screamed desperately, daring the figure to reveal his true identity and purpose. The hooded figure remained silent for a moment, and then, with a sudden movement, raised his hood. What they saw left them speechless. Under the hood, there was no human face, but rather a shadowy void, an absence of light and identity. It was as if the hooded figure was a manifestation of darkness itself. The figure reached out its hand towards Lucas, as if wanting to touch him. Lucas closed his eyes and prepared to face the inevitable. But instead of feeling the icy touch, he felt a wave of warmth and light envelop him. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the living room, but the hooded figure and shadows were gone. His friend was at his side, just as stunned as he was. The TV was showing the horror movie, but now it was just a movie, without supernatural threats. They exchanged confused and relieved looks. The nightmare was over, and they were back to reality. Lucas never knew what really happened that night, whether it was a paranormal event or an illusion of his troubled mind. As the first rays of sunlight appeared over the horizon, they left the house and walked together toward the morning light. They could feel the comforting warmth of the sun, chasing away the shadows of the night before. Lucas knew that experience would leave scars on his mind, but he was determined to move on. He had survived the terror of the night and was determined to face whatever the future held.